Hey there, welcome to the music of Los Ojos. For about the next 15 minutes, I'll walk you through some of the early inspiration, the whole kind of genesis story of how I came to work on the original soundtrack for the game NeoCab by Chance Agency, and later on in the presentation, I'll break down one of the tracks from the soundtrack and just kind of show the sonic palette and a little bit the sound of the music of Los Ojos. Super appreciate you being here. Put a little smiley face just to show how serious I am about that. My name is Joe, and if you're so inclined, you can find me on Twitter at JosephXBurke. I post photos of my cat Rhonda and my bunny Benoit, and really hoping in 2019 to break through that fabled 300 follower ceiling. So everyone's saying, hey, no way this guy's going to do it, no way. But maybe we can work on it together and it'll happen and we'll feel so good. I make music as Obfusc, and I've been doing that since about 2005. I make primarily electronic music, almost always instrumental. A lot of synths, oftentimes guitars, a bit of a post-rock influence, and it's kind of, to me, the impetus for it has always been making the type of music that I want to listen to. So therefore it kind of, changes with, whatever the inspiration is that's, kind of driving it. But that said, I use a lot of weird samples at times. I record odd field recordings in strange places and incorporate those for ambient kind of, textures. And overall, it's been just kind of a really fun project to kind of, work on all these years. Over those years, I've released a bunch of albums, EPs, splits, a 7-inch. I've worked with some awesome artists, some awesome labels, and I've met a lot of really cool people, whom I, find to be some of my closest friends to this day. And it's just been an awesome experience. You might know my work from the Monument Valley soundtrack, which is completely surreal and amazing to be in any way, shape, or form connected with that amazing, amazing game. And that have directly led to being featured on House of Cards in a scene where Kevin Spacey, I'll put that face there just so you know how I feel, was playing the game on his iPad. Awesome, awesome as a visual, tricky now, hence the emoji. But I also had my work featured on CSI Miami, which, if you're an intellectual, obviously you're deep in that show, so I don't need to tell you anything else about how completely incredible it is. Gotta say, #blessed. I mean, this project's been, awesome. It's taken me to some fun places, up to and including where I'm at right now, which is working on NeoCab. How did I get here? How did I start working on this game with the awesome crew at Chance Agency? I don't know. I mean, it's just been kind of amazing, and really, I mean, it's kind of a long story, but I think it's worth telling, because if I don't tell it, who will tell the tale? You know what I mean? It all started with Firewatch, actually. I was following Campo Santo on Twitter, and a couple of the developers, and just kind of keeping an eye on things. And I mean, I was so super jazzed for the game to come out. And when it did come out, I, like everyone else should or does, I completely loved the game. It was just such an amazing experience. And while I was following it and keeping such a close eye on it, they signal boosted one of their developers named Patrick Ewing, and who ran a radio show on San Francisco's BFF.FM called Warm Focus, which was this genre agnostic, amazing, kind of creative inspiration, just like kind of when you've got your head down and you're just like lost in a creative project, you want music that kind of propels you forward, that doesn't get in the way. And he just did such a great job with that music. And I remembered the name. I thought, Warm Focus, that sounds so familiar. And then I looked back and I saw he had kind of like reached out at some point and said, hey, I'm playing your music on my show, check it out. And so I checked it out a number of times and always really enjoyed myself. So we kind of became Twitter friends. Well, when I saw that Firewatch was out, I loved it. It's one of the only games I've ever cried at the intro. That's something. Achievement unlocked. Eventually, I kind of reached out to Patrick. I'm like, well, so you're done with Warm Focus, you're done with Firewatch, what are you working on next? And he says, we should really talk about what I'm doing next. #video games. I tend to get ahead of myself, my imagination starts going places, and I thought, oh snap, this guy's working on a new game and maybe he wants me to make music for it or something. Well, that kind of came to fruition, and we start talking a little bit of what we're thinking. He gives me this nice big playlist of things that really inspire him. Tells me the kind of the landscape that he's working with in this kind of near future dystopian automated world that where basically human identity is kind of at odds with the world at whole. And we start talking music. Some of the overlaps for us, like Hong Kong Express, 2814, both like just total like vaporwave staples. Lots of textures, ambient kind of background sounds, and just just it feels like the city's alive in the music, if that makes sense. We start talking One O Tricks Point Never, kind of these weird abstract, it's kind of gauzy's the word that really came up a lot in our early conversations about the music that he kind of was attracted to, and I totally get it. Like just these weird kind of these sounds that I just keep coming back to gauzy. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, I'll get to kind of how I kind of view that sound. Kanono #1, Congotronics, these awesome African rhythms and just kalimba-driven melodies, kind of basically the fusion of like kind of traditional African instrumentation. So, kind of in that whole like world music vibe, but then updated to kind of be in the electronic scope, if that makes sense. Then I start seeing the early mood concepts from Vincent Perea, and it just basically like unlocked this part of my brain where immediately it's like I could hear what I thought the music should sound like for the game. And his work was already so striking, but also just like so evocative of this like this night mood. And I've always been one of those people, I guess like so many people probably, I just love nighttime. And I love when I lived in New York, I lived outside of Chicago now, but when I lived in New York, it was just all about being around at night, and just you could just like those reflections off the city streets when it was raining, and just the sounds, just like being just bathed in the sounds. And so I had some ideas that didn't end up going into the soundtrack, but some of those ideas were kind of incorporating more of those city sounds kind of baked into the sound of the music. Conversations, like little bits, again coming back to the field recordings thing, kind of baking those sounds into the music. It didn't go forward, but it was something I thought about. And actually this image is kind of like perfect to kind of symbolize what I was thinking. It was like hearing traffic sounds, hearing maybe distant conversations. Didn't go forward, but it was, I'm just saying like how evocative this image in particular was, and the next. Again, just like really, it kind of hit me in this kind of like near future Southern California way, where it's like I could feel the breeze, I could feel the nighttime. And so it just really spoke to like that early musical inspiration. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of how that all, fleshed out. It was basically, I would come down to my workspace, and it was different than how I normally work on music. Normally I would just sit down and work and kind of toil over something, and sometimes you kind of bang your head into the wall as, a creative of any variety. I work as a graphic designer by day, so I'm kind of familiar with banging my head into the wall, when I hit kind of creative roadblocks. But with music for me, it's a lot of times I'll, get a couple melodies down, and then I just can't figure out how to connect that to something else. Well, so for this, it was like I was basically trying to work in really quick drafts. And so what I would do is I would basically sit down, give myself an hour. If I didn't hit into something I liked within 20 to 30 minutes, I'd bail. I'd go play video games. I'd read a book, sketch or something. I'd go, talk with my lady, just hang out, basically. Just try not to make it like a super high pressure thing. If it stuck, then it would give me something to like kind of finish. And I would basically like just create these 2-minute drafts, and that came pretty quickly. Like night after night, I would just keep doing these, and before too long, I mean, based on those 2 or 3 images I saw from Vincent, like I basically started just kind of creating the music really early on. And I started thinking of them as kind of these fictitious corners of the city, that the city of Los Ojos was not really formed yet, but then in my head, it's like I could kind of see, like what I was imagining was, if you're a New Yorker, you're familiar with like Red Hook, you're thinking the docks, the kind of the cranes, these like desolate city streets, in Brooklyn and chunks of the Bronx and stuff, and I started thinking about like our whole game is about this driver at night and just like these places you end up to pick up passengers or drop them off. And I started thinking about photos I'd seen in San Francisco of like the port of Oakland and other places that just kind of like inspired a certain kind of like nighttime desolation, and that informed the sonic palette to me. So I'll give you like I kind of split out some little sounds, just kind of like little mood pieces. So one of the tones, sparse and delayed sounds. So I'll let you kind of hear what I think that sounds like. So a lot of space, a lot of reverb and stereo delay. Let's hear what round two. We got pulsing arpeggios. There's a lot of arpeggios on the NeoCab soundtrack. This one you'll hear like there's definitely like a pulsing vibe. All these sounds to me are very nighttime, which is kind of the game. I mean, the game is all at night, so I mean it was made to feel like it was a nighttime driving vibe. The next sample is gauzy and filtered, and again, getting back to that One O Tricks Point Never reference, the gauze. I don't know if I can put it into words, but maybe you'll understand after I play this. So I guess it's kind of a little bit of a thing where I don't know, I feel like you can kind of see through it, if that makes sense. Like it's thin, but also with the filtering of it, it kind of just becomes this warped mesh. I don't know. It's a common theme in a lot of the music on the soundtrack. We got gnarly bass in some of the tracks. You can kind of hear it, an example of it here. And actually that comes from a track that also features, coming back to that Konono #1, kalimbas. So I ordered a $25 kalimba off of Amazon, and I played with it a lot. I mean, there's probably 2 or 3 songs on the soundtrack that pretty heavily feature kalimbas, and it also kind of ties back to that Hong Kong Express, which if you're not familiar, definitely check out that record. I think it's Hong Kong Express 2047, and particularly the first track on that, definitely worth hearing. Just such good vibes. I mean, realistically, I could talk all day, all night about this, but I've got a time constraint. So let's jump into a track breakdown. Cool, so I've chosen the track Neon Moon to break down, and it's kind of special on the soundtrack because it's one of 2 songs that features Chris Ward, Brooklyn-based saxophonist who goes by the moniker The Saxophone Warrior. And little trivia side note, Chris and Patrick grew up together, went to middle school together, and all that stuff. So I think that's pretty cool and worth mentioning too. So basically, this kind of all ties back to the early on days where Patrick and I had kind of like, cheekily thought it'd be kind of cool to amp up the noir vibes in some of the music, or at least some of it. And so after I'd kind of completed most of the soundtrack work, there was still like a couple tracks where it felt like, hey, we should get some sax on this. And really, basically, I just handed off the whole soundtrack to Chris and asked him, hey, kind of like what jumps out to you. He gave me like a list. We chose a couple of those, and the project from there, I mean, just like the collaboration between the 2 of us was just seamless. It was basically he would make some parts, and all of them felt right. It was just a matter of like taking the little tiny parts that felt really, really, really right, and then doing like little edits, and then kind of mixing them in. And he was just such a great dude to work with, super talented, and and just, way better musician than I am. So, and also the first time I've ever worked with a saxophonist in any context. So, let's get right into it after I just gave you like a whole 2-minute intro. But, so this basically, I'm going to kind of do some little solo parts so you can kind of hear the individual instruments. This is a bass part. And if this is a whole new environment for you, if you've never seen kind of a digital audio workstation or DAW, this is the arrange window. I do personally work on 2 monitors, so everything is off to the right hand side. My whole my mixer window and my piano roll for editing MIDI parts, and various effects windows and stuff like that for tweaking parameters of effects. But for the sake of this video, I'm just limiting it to a stripped down arrange window. And you can see all these yellow lines here. These are all mix automation lines. Volume fades. There's if you see some faint lines, there's probably other effects going on, and obviously there's some pan automation here, stereo panning from left to right, stuff like that, and little cuts of various effects. But just to give you a little quick primer. So yeah, let's hear some of the sounds, shall we? So that's my plunky bass that I actually used a lot on the soundtrack, and I use it in a lot of different ways. I would sometimes shorten it, sometimes throw it through an arpeggiator, and then kind of get these nice little plunky pulsing sounds, and that kind of ties back to when I mentioned the pulsy sounds. I have this sound here, the melodic ping pong. I've had this preset. I saved this thing probably back in 2007, 2008, and it's always been one of those things when I don't know what to do, I go grab that melodic ping pong because it always does something interesting. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to solo this out so you can hear just that. Let's hear it. So you can kind of hear how that's layering. So let's check out this here, the Warble Arp preset that I've made. This is probably going to be, I could give it other names. Some of the super observant in the crowd may notice what references I might make in naming this preset. I'm not sure, but here goes. So down here, actually, here's one of the first sax parts that I used, and I'll mute everything else so you can just kind of hear. This was kind of used in almost an ambient context. Here you go. So you can hear that really, really heavy delay and reverb. And one of the things that Chris and I really hit it off on, we kind of, with another track that we collaborated on for the soundtrack called Aquamarine Vista, that one had a super kind of cheeky dancehall, kind of reggae dubby vibe. And I mean, I say that total tongue-in-cheek, but that kind of dubby sound for the sax that I basically applied to his sax parts on the other song, I just loved that so much. I ended up using kind of that same idea here, and so you can kind of hear that dubbed out tape delay, basically, just really feedback heavy. And it just felt super sultry and perfect for a kind of neo-noir vibe, if you will. So let's get into this. This is where he really locked into a groove, and I mean, it just felt like basically the perfect spot for, here, I'm actually going to mute, just take everything off, and you can just hear everything together in this nice groove breakdown part. I mean, again, it was one of those things where the song felt pretty good, pretty right, and then the moment you add in that saxophone, it just took it to another level. So I don't think the song would be half as good without his contribution. So I say that publicly for everyone to enjoy my heaping on of the praise of the saxophone warrior. So let's see here. Basically, the rest of the song, I'm going to let a little bit of this just play. I'm also planning on tweeting out a link, albeit kind of in an unmastered form, just so you can hear the whole song without the stops and starts in its entirety. It's about 2 minutes and 20 or 30 seconds, but I'll give you this like last little playthrough after the change. I'll give you a little bit more there, so you can kind of just hear how the rest of the track plays out, and so you get a whole visual of what the ending of the song sounds like. All right, well, so thank you so much for joining me for this, and really check out my Twitter at JosephXBurke, and I'll tweet out that link shortly, and you can check it out. I'll just put it on SoundCloud or something like that, and probably take it down eventually because I just don't want silly little demos floating around out there. But yeah, thanks again, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope it kind of gave you a glimpse into the music of Los Ojos, and can't wait for you to play the game. Thanks.